Hey everyone, good afternoon. My name is Nick Roy, and like Chris mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit today about kind of getting started with automation. So a little bit of background about myself. I live in Boston, Massachusetts, but I started using automation platforms really back when it was still just called SAO. I just looked on LinkedIn this morning. It was back in January 2017. So this was really before, a lot of the things we think about today were even really defined, and just kind of talk about some of the lessons learned along the way, some of the problems we ran into. I'm happy to admit some of the mistakes that we made, but really just talk about lessons learned, kind of what we figured out, what works, what didn't work, and more importantly, how we can avoid some of these mistakes from happening. And then we'll talk about just a little bit of how to get started. We'll talk about some examples. And we're going to drop some content in the Slack channel also. I'll be in there too, kind of keeping an eye on it after this. So if anyone does have any questions or wants to catch up, I'll be hanging out in there also. So to kind of take a step back from everything, where did this idea of these automation platforms start? Where did it all come from? And I always like to start off, if we saw on the intro slide, I like to start off with a picture of my cat. But we also like to just start off, kind of automation is not a new concept by any means. It's something we've been trying to do for a long time. Really, anytime we run into something that we say, this is something that's repetitive, this is something we can offload to a machine. These are pretty simple tasks that we can be not spending so much time on, freeing up our time to do the more interesting work, doing a lot more of the research and really digging into the things that are interesting to us and getting our time back to work on different projects. And this is really one of the things that we saw a lot, and one of the things we always try to focus on is really identifying, what are these things that we can easily automate? What is the repetitive part of our tasks that we're doing, our workflows that maybe we're thinking about or just subconsciously doing every day? And trying to identify how we can offload some of this to a machine and get some of this time back. So for me personally, kind of what kicked all this off was about 7-8 years ago, looking at some of our Nessus results. We were looking at all of the NetStat active connections we were pulling back. And I was talking with someone and we said, hey, it would be kind of a cool idea would be if we take all this data that we're getting back. Right around this time, there were a lot of threat services that were coming online. And we were just starting to, we had the idea, what if we take all these IPs that we're connecting out to and just look them up? Who knows what we'll find, but it's not something I want to do manually. It's not something we can even really do manually. But if we pull back this data and we start to automate it, will we find anything interesting? Will this catch anything, connections out to something malicious? We weren't really sure what we were going to find, but we knew it was something that we just could not do by hand and have that scale in any real sense. But along the same time, you start to run into some problems when you do this, because one of the first challenges is you have to just go out and actually write all the code to do this yourself. This is a screenshot from an old piece of code that I wrote to integrate into Nessus, which I don't even think it works anymore. But we started having to just write a whole bunch of code to build all these integrations. We spent a lot of time just doing things that are not really that fun, parsing data because things weren't supported via APIs. Scraping pages, trying to figure out how we could get the data that we needed. And really just taking a lot of time trying to get some of these simple things built out and running. And then naturally, as we are building out any kind of scripts and working on this, we start to run into some of the other problems that I'm sure everyone else has faced. We all make mistakes. We start running our code, we find out that we called the wrong API, we have a spelling error in there, we have an error in our logic and things aren't working. So now something that we thought, hey, this would be kind of interesting to do, really just started taking more and more time. We started spending more time writing code, we started spending more time debugging code. And really, just like I'm sure everyone else does, we spent more time just researching our problems. How can I copy and paste from Stack Overflow to solve this quickly? Do I even really understand what I'm copying and pasting? Spending more time doing research, understanding different libraries, understanding different API calls that maybe we need to be making. And it really just started to add up for something which, we thought would be pretty simple and kind of a neat idea. Take some IP addresses and look them up in these different reputation services. So we had all these problems that we started facing. Again, a lot of time writing code. It's gotten much better over the last 7 or 8 years, but a lot of APIs were pretty poorly documented, if they did have any kind of documentation. Some people still just didn't have APIs that were really supported, or they were available, but not any real documentation. We have the very technical hit by a bus problem that we faced, where if I didn't have good documentation, I didn't have good comments in my code, would someone else be able to pick this up if they needed to? Would they be able to make changes? Would they be able to understand what I had developed? And I think one of the biggest things is we ran into this idea of we can't really do anything complex here. I mean, it's certainly possible. We can do anything if we just write more code. But really, we were just focusing on, I have some inputs, I need some outputs, and that's about it. We weren't trying to say, okay, once I have all this data, what else can I do with it? I found all these bad IPs. What can I do with this data? We were still reviewing a lot of that data manually once we got it back. So it became harder to build a lot of these complex workflows. And then, of course, APIs change. There's new research that gets published, and we have new ideas for things that we want to build. And it really just kind of became this snowball effect of building and maintaining things for some of these ideas, which were pretty simple, and we felt like they should have been a little bit faster to start building out. So this is about the time when we started to hear about some of these automation platforms. A good friend of mine said, hey, have you seen some of these? And I said, no, this is kind of a new thing. It looks pretty interesting. And I started working for an automation company right around that time as well. And one of the things when I first met everyone there after I started, I said, hey, what are best practices? How do we go about doing this? And this was, again, back in 2017. They said, we're really not sure. It's a pretty new market. It's a pretty new field. We have some ideas, but really just go figure out what works and what doesn't. So we used to say things like, hey, you know what? It's okay if you don't have things documented. There's these visual editors now. This is all self-documenting. It's okay if you don't have API keys now. It's okay if you don't have any of these integrations in place. We can always go back in and add this later. And then we'd start to get excited as we build out playbooks. This is really cool. Let's start to build other things based off of this. But we never finished what we set out to build. And then some of these things are things that we still ran into further on down the line. We should probably test every single edge case that we can think of, instead of just breaking our problems down into smaller pieces and making things much more easy to manage and much easier to test. But again, things were still really new. We were still really excited about automation and just trying to figure out ways where we could make all of our lives easier. And I think, I'm sure, as everyone's been on this forum today, which has been fantastic, hearing everyone's different perspectives, but generally when we think about automation platforms, we can kind of boil it down to a standard set of things that are provided. There's typically a set of APIs and conventions that anyone can understand, which is going to solve our problem of not everyone knowing what this script is doing. Now it's a lot more standardized to make it easier to see what's going on. And a lot of that is helped with these visual playbook builders. As someone who started out writing a lot of code and then learned about visual playbook editors, I actually try to do as much as possible visually, just to save myself some time. And then from there, one of the things that started to get added in over time was adding in more of these response capabilities, adding into the R to SOAR. But adding in a place now, because we had all this data in one place, we were taking in all these alerts, we were doing all these reputation lookups. People started to say, hey, it'd be really nice to just work out of here even further and just start to assign things to our analysts and really just have this one place for response, which was a really cool thing to see, that people were really using it that way. And then having a marketplace for content, being able to get new playbooks, new resources, even just using it for new ideas that we can build. And then finally, just a flexible platform. As much as I love visual editors, we still need to go in there and usually just write a couple lines of code here and there just to make everything play nice together. And so when we start to think about kind of what are the goals for automation, Again, we want to start to identify anything that we would consider these mundane actions. We've always said anything we are doing 3 times or more a day. We want to look to try to automate that. We want to try to find use cases where maybe we need to respond to this rapidly. And that could be any number of use cases. That can extend to any number of areas, but things where maybe we need to respond rapidly and then have someone else come in and kind of follow up off of that. The nice thing is as we are starting to think about this, we have a lot of cool security tools. We can start to integrate across these multiple components. We can have them all play nicely together. And because we are handing this off to a machine, as we are building these playbooks, we can start to reduce the amount of errors. One of the things we found interesting early on was we used to go out and just interview people when we were talking to them about playbook building. And we found a lot of times when we would ask, how do you respond to a certain type of alert? Or how do you respond to a phishing email? Everyone in the organization would give us a completely different answer. And that's fine. We're not saying there's a right or wrong way necessarily, but we want to make sure that at least if I have a group of people that are working on these alerts, that we all have at least the same set of data. We can always go out and get more data to make decisions if we need it, but at least we all know we're kind of standardizing on what we're looking at. And we're making sure that we're not missing anything either as part of our investigations and our response to these different alerts that we're seeing. So as we start to kind of get into automation, we talked a little bit about some of the problems it's trying to solve and some of the goals for automation, but how do we start to think about these different use cases? We've always said anything you do 3 times or more a day is a great candidate for automation. We also like to, I've always thought this was an interesting one. What do you just not like doing? We've gotten a lot of really cool use cases over the years about just being honest with people. Are there things you do every day where you say, man, you know what, this is something small. If I could just automate this and not have to worry about it, my day would be so much better. So we want to find those kind of use cases as well. They don't have to be necessarily the traditional use cases we always think of. It's that there's been a ton of them over the years where it's just been really interesting use cases that we may not have thought of. And one of the most important things that I've always seen also is trying to automate smaller tasks before the larger ones. And what I mean by that is if I have something I do 30 times a day that would take me a minute, I want to try to automate that before I try to tackle something I do once a day that takes 30 minutes. Because generally that's going to be something easier to automate. We can probably break that down into a very small series of steps, something that's probably repeatable. And we get our time back for those larger tasks. And then I have this more time to kind of start thinking about how can I tackle these bigger challenges. And we can take this approach to any kind of use cases we're deploying. What are kind of the small things that we can do first? What are the parts of this that take the most time? Let's just get that automation working first. Let's test it. Let's make sure we have the data we need. And then we can start to think about how can I expand on this? How can I start to tackle some of the bigger problems here? But let's really find the core of what's taking up the most time here. So as we start to think about our different use cases, we want to start to identify them. And this is where we can start to just build out our workflow. What kind of steps do we need to take here? And really during this time, we start to surface a lot of interesting things. Obviously, we want to include any kind of decisions or logic as this playbook. What would we do here? How would we make a distinction between malicious or not malicious? Or what do we want to consider a gray area? Maybe something where automation doesn't apply to this. This is something that's more built for a human analyst as opposed to something I can offload to a machine. This also lets us identify what kind of tools do we need. Do we have the right accounts? Do we have the permissions available? Because again, a lot of this can take time when we start building this out. We want to make sure we have all of that identified early on, because if it is going to take time to get these accounts created, we want to identify that before we even start building our playbooks. And then from there, we also get just thoughts about what kind of data does this take to run this playbook? Is this an alert coming out of my SIM? Is this phishing emails that users are forwarding to me that I need to look at? What kind of data is required? And then what's my end state as well? Do I just want to reply back to a user and say, yes, go ahead, click this link. It's perfectly safe. Or do I want to start saying, thank you for reporting this? This definitely was a phishing link. Do I need to put this into another system somewhere? We want to take all this data, and again, we want to have this plan. We want to dream big with it. But when we get into implementing, we'll talk about how we can start kind of with the smaller use cases and just kind of iterate through and grow these use cases over time. So we're not looking at this feeling overwhelmed, saying, I'll never be able to get all this done. We'll start with really just the small things that are going to get us our time back. And then we can start to work further towards, some of these more challenging things that might take more work to implement. So one of the questions they always got was, what are the common use cases? And I'm sure by now everyone has heard different use cases as well that apply. These were always kind of the common ones that we always built out. Again, we'll talk about some of these again when we get into the examples. And then some of the one I always like talking about is the interesting use cases, which are typically outside of the regular things we're trying to automate. But these were always just ones that stood out over the years, especially things for like doing training with our users or anything with, outside of security. When I had to build a playbook to do a bunch of database updates and commits, that was a fun one. I knew what I was doing, but I am not a database person by any means. Look, as long as this looks good to everyone, it'll work. But I have no suggestions one way or another on if this is the right way to do it. But as we start to identify all these different use cases and we start to map out what we want to do, what our playbooks would look like, what it would take to actually run these. One of the other things we started to notice was over time, as we are building out our different workflows and automating our use cases, we started to see that people were kind of running into some problems with the playbooks that they had. And that's natural. Things would change in the environment. There'd be new tools available. The data we were looking at would change slightly. All sorts of little issues that we would run into. And, we'd have to start kind of fixing things. But we can take this methodical approach using the software development lifecycle. And if we start to adopt this way of kind of breaking down the problems, we can start to identify some of them earlier. So it's not as much of a heavy lift if we go back and say 9 months later or a year later, look at our playbook and say, we need to make all of these changes. Again, if we're starting to break this into these kind of smaller pieces, it's going to make it easier to just keep these playbooks up to date and make sure that we are identifying problems as they're coming up, as opposed to just kind of letting things sit and then over time realizing we need to make a lot of changes, which is going to take more time to build and test and make sure that it's still doing everything that we need it to be doing. And the nice thing about the software development lifecycle is a lot of it maps to what we would normally be doing when we're building our playbooks anyway. So we can take this same approach. The nice thing is we can also use this for really anything outside of building playbooks as well. I've seen a lot of people use this for deploying any kind of detection rules or building any kind of SIM alerts. But it's the same things that we would normally do. But we want to make sure that we keep iterating over this. We keep repeating these steps. Because if I have a playbook that's been running for a couple of months, I want to still identify any of the current problems. We can do this early on when we're building a new playbook, or we can use this for any existing playbooks that we have. And it would be the same things that we would normally do. What are the current problems? What's the scope of them? How long do we think it's going to take to address all of this? And any kind of requirements gathering at this stage. And then just like before, we want to sit down and plan and design. What is this going to look like? What kind of data do we need? What kind of integrations? Did anything change there? Build out our new workflows, what they might look like. Do we need to add anything? Do we need to modify our logic in our playbooks? And then we can start building and testing. And again, because we are breaking this down into smaller pieces, one, it's going to become easier to build our playbooks because now we're not trying to tackle the entire thing at once. We're just building out a smaller part of it, or we're just modifying a small piece of this playbook. So it's going to make it easier to build and design this playbook, but testing is going to be easier also. We're not getting to the end of our whole playbook and saying, oh, I need to test all these different use cases, which goes down all these different branches. We have these smaller pieces. It's going to be easier to test our playbook. And one of the most interesting things that I've always liked doing is really in this deploy and measure phase. how can we actually measure these playbooks? Usually it's pretty easy to find, when a playbook fails, because usually we go, oh, I have to do this manually now. Or if individual parts of my playbook are failing because an API key has expired or something like that happens, it's pretty easy to identify. But we can also start to build almost a feedback loop into our playbooks. There's ways where we can start to get feedback about what the playbook was. Did we have the right data? And these are things that we can also build in as sort of a monthly review cycle to identify problems that may not be as obvious when our playbooks are running. So as we start to take a more methodical approach to this, again, it really becomes important to just break things down into these smaller pieces. What are the things that we can do to automate and get our time back so we can focus on some of those bigger problems? We always want to identify, again, those small things first, and then we have more time for those bigger problems later on. Now, one of the coolest things that I've seen some people start doing with their playbooks that they're building is actually building in essentially a survey into their playbook. And what we would do is, as we started to build out our playbooks, typically after we do all the information gathering, there'd really be about 3 paths. One would be for, yes, this is absolutely malicious, we can take automated actions on it. Or we have this is absolutely not malicious, we know this for a fact, we can also automate our response to this. But there's still usually a lot of gray area where we need to figure out how much do we want to actually automate here. And this is where a lot of the automation platforms also have something like a method built in where we can just send a prompt or get some kind of input from a user, whether that's through the platform itself or through any kind of integration with a ticketing system or something like Slack. But if that triggered, at the end of the playbook, they would also just send a prompt back to whoever responded and just ask questions like this. Were there any problems with the results? Was this a false positive? If it was, what was the reason for this? Was there anything that you had to do, any other data sources you had to use to make a decision? And then we would start to review that once a month and just start to see, again, where maybe some of these playbooks have some opportunity to add in additional automation. If there's something that my analyst has to go and get data from a tool every time, I want to find that and I want to build that into my playbook. If something is a false positive every time, maybe I need to change some of my detection rules. Maybe if it's something like problems with a user account, maybe I need to teach my users not to just respond to every email and give away your credentials. So it just lets us identify some of these problems that may not necessarily come out as we are building our playbooks, but just start to get some of that feedback and find opportunities either to, again, go back and take this iterative approach to updating our playbooks, or find other ways where we can just make these playbooks more efficient by either just feeding the right data into it or making data changes to the data that's being fed into our SOAR platform. So one of the things I wanted to walk through is kind of an example of how we would go about doing this. And one of my favorite things to talk about, noisy sim alerts. I'm sure everyone has a couple of these as well. But how can we start to kind of take this iterative approach? How would we start to break this down? What are the small things that we would tackle first? And then as I start to build this up, what are kind of my end goals for everything? And just to give a little bit of background, because we've been talking a lot about automation and not introduce GreyNoise at all. GreyNoise, what we do is we are not an automation platform, but what we do is we essentially listen to what we would consider background noise on the internet. So all of the scanning that's occurring from different vendors, scanning that's occurring from researchers, scanning for malicious purposes, people in Boston who have misconfigured Nmap scans, all of that is usually filling up all of our alerts and our logs and just adding in a lot of this extra noise. So what we do is we actually listen to all of this on the internet. We categorize all of this data. We classify the type of traffic we're seeing, with the idea being that now we can use this as part of our data and our workflow. So I can enrich data in my SIM and kind of figure out what's more opportunistic versus what's more targeted towards my organization. Or we can just do these lookups as part of our automation platform. We provide all of the requests that these IPs are making. So if I want to start doing any kind of hunting based off of this, there's a lot of interesting ways we can use this data. And by way of how we gather this data, we also have a lot of information about just what people are scanning for. What kind of vulnerabilities are they scanning for? What kind of threats are trending? So we can also do a lot of research for if we want to do some kind of structured hunts. We can give an idea of really what we're observing and what we see people scanning for across the internet. So it's a little bit different of an approach to things, but really the idea is we want to just kind of filter out all of this noise. And we can do this, again, a number of ways, either by identifying just a lot of this noise that's hitting any of our IPs we're responsible for, or just identifying all these common services. So if I am looking through any of my outbound traffic, I can just filter out a lot of that traffic and have kind of a unique look at whatever is left. So anything not going out to Slack, Office 365, all those common services. And I can keep hunting off of that to find some of those more interesting IPs and domains that, again, maybe we need a human to start looking at. So with all that being said, just using a simple example, a noisy alert for any kind of brute force activity. When I looked this up the other day in GreyNoise, we had about 26,000 IPs that we saw that were attempting to brute force credentials over SSH. So when we start to identify what our problems are, again, we probably just have too much alert caused by a lot of this noise. There might be alerts that we're just saying, yeah, you know what, this is probably a false positive, but we're not actually really digging into a lot of these. And because honestly, it's going to take, just by how much data there is, takes a long time to gather all that data, find any kind of similar alerts, and then deciding, do we even need to change the priority on these alerts? Is this maybe something we need to focus a little bit more on? Or is this something that we can say, yeah, you know what, this really just is a lot of noise. Not that we're going to ignore it, but we're going to reprioritize that a little bit lower. So as we start to identify what we want to automate, we want to start to plan out what we're going to do. So we want to start to just focus on the fundamentals first. Again, how can I start to take a lot of these noisy alerts? How can I get this information faster? And where am I getting my data from? In the example that I walked through, I just did all my enrichment in the SIM. I have a lot of data in there that gets enriched, and then I just feed it into my SOAR platforms. Because now what I can do is I can just do a lot of those quick additional checks to make sure, yes, this really is noise. This isn't something I need to worry about. In this case, I don't even want to waste anyone's time with this. I'm just going to close all of this out. So we can start to identify what kind of data we need, what kind of integrations we need, and then any kind of thresholds we want to set also. If there is something that we decide is looking malicious, is there a time when we can maybe just block things automatically? But all of this can come out during our planning stage. And again, we don't have to be day one blocking IP addresses. We can just start off with the simple things, just identifying even what we don't have to worry about. So I can focus on things that are maybe a little more suspicious looking, so I can get that time back. Now, this is a screenshot from my firewall data that I have. We break it down into 3 categories in my case. The left side is IPs that were scanning me, that GreyNoise also identified as noise. These are all just port scanners and people just generally looking for any kind of services exposed on the internet. The right side is IP addresses that GreyNoise has not observed. So in my case, those are probably the 2 that I want to look at first. They're a little bit more targeted towards my organization. But it's this middle column that really is a nice starting point that I can automate off of. These are IP addresses that I've seen scanning me. These are IP addresses that we've observed at GreyNoise doing malicious things across the internet. And if we look at a couple of these here, some of them have pretty simple things we can build playbooks for. Specifically, when we get into things like the brute forcers, really, I just want to see, did I get a login from this IP address? If I didn't, close it out, that alert. If I did, escalate and panic. Same thing with any IP addresses scanning for vulnerabilities. I want to check and see, do I have checked my vulnerability scanner? We saw Threat Connect's presentation right before this with some of the vulnerability data also. How can I start to prioritize those vulnerabilities? Am I exposed to this? Are people scanning for this? But again, we want to just take a lot of these different things where maybe we are kind of just doing different lookups, different checks, and have kind of this documented process for how we would respond to these things. And with that being said, using the SSH brute forcer as an example, this is just, again, a simple playbook that we can build. I see this brute force attempt. I want to just query back to my SIM. Did I see a login? If not, close it out. If we did, escalate and panic. It recorded some videos that have a little bit more details on this also. If anyone's interested, we'll drop those in Slack. We also have another one for doing a little bit more research about vulnerabilities and scanning the internet, and just adding in rules to our firewall to just automatically block a lot of that noise as well. And as we start to build out all these playbooks, again, we're taking these smaller approaches, simple playbook where we're getting a lot of value out of it. Again, just identifying, is there anything in there? But it makes it easier to test. And then I can always build this out further. Maybe I didn't see a login, but looking up that IP, we do see a lot of other suspicious things based off of it. Maybe that's the next part of my playbook, is building out some of that additional enrichments in here. So by having that whiteboard session and planning it out, I can keep building on this. I can keep iterating on this. But I'm addressing some of the things that are just taking up a lot of time right now, just clearing out a lot of that noise and just making sure that it's not wasting my analyst time with a lot of that repetitive work and just trying to figure out, what are these IPs? What are they doing? How are they being used? Is this just someone trying this across every IP on the internet? Or is this something really targeted towards my organization? And again, as we are building this all out, we want to make sure we're measuring as best as possible. Are there times, where are my playbooks being escalated? What's happening there? Is there additional data that I can provide? Are there additional things I can do to automate? Are there certain parts of my playbook that are failing? Are there certain actions? I want to identify those. And again, I can build that into my more methodical approach of just building, testing, and maintaining these playbooks over time. So just to wrap it up, because I know we are coming up on time here. Again, when we want to start thinking about automation, we want to make sure we are just planning as much as possible for what we want to do before actually jumping into actually building playbooks. We want to identify what's repetitive, what can be easily automated. A lot of times I would get questions about how can I respond to APT XYZ with the playbook. And really what we're trying to do is focus on the other side of that. What's everything I can automate so I have that time back to go focus on some of these bigger problems, things that maybe aren't as automated or things that aren't as repetitive. And if we have this methodical approach to building playbooks, we can make sure that we are breaking things down into manageable pieces, making sure that we're still testing our results. We're not testing everything at the end, but we can still build in this feedback loop for growing and expanding our use cases, because we did document everything at the start and we have a plan for where we want to be, ideal state at the end when we do have everything completed. So that's all I had. Again, we'll drop some videos in the Slack channel. They'll be hanging out in there also. But thank you, everyone, for hanging out this afternoon, or Chris, early in the morning.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Great insight. Really like the way that you were talking about breaking it down there and focusing on a repeatable process, but also showing the little steps that are necessary in order to really make the issues addressable from a perspective of people being really busy with a lot of other work and then trying to get ahead. And you have some real great insight that you provided for how to do that.